Hey folks, you're very welcome back to another episode of the Meditations on Movement podcast. Today we're going to be discussing a bit of a reflection. We're going to be discussing what I learned after 28 days of handstands. Now, if you're someone that's followed me for a period of time on social media, you'd have seen that over the past, say, 2 years or so, I've got into more of a movement focus with my training and with my practice. And with that comes a lot of acrobatic maneuvers. And handstands are sort of a part of that in a general way. It's not specifically that handstands are the be all and end all in my practice. They're just a small little part of it that I recognized wasn't really improving. So the goal that I set myself was to be as consistent as I could with handstands within a 28-day period. Not necessarily working on handstands specifically every day because I knew it was going to be a lot of stress and strain on the wrists and the shoulders, but making it my primary focus was a way to think of it. My intention really was to say, okay, other things in my practice and in my training are really important at this moment in time, but what would happen if I gave it a good period of time working on them? I knew they would improve, and I think what I was doing with my practice was I was just sprinkling it in. And while that can be relevant when you've actually mastered something or you've gained a lot of experience in it, just kind of like keeping up a bare minimum amount usually does the trick, keeps you somewhat making progress, maybe like a very small amount, but not a crazy amount. And I knew with my handstands, they'd improved a little bit over that sort of 2 year period, but they definitely hadn't improved to what they could have been, which is, full consistent sort of 5-10 second holds. So that's what I said to myself. I knew that I was making a little bit of progress with my handstands. So the goal for the 28 days for me anyway was to be able to get more consistent 5-10 second holds. And how I sort of judged that then was when I went for my freestanding handstand attempts, was I able to get, 3 seconds initially somewhat consistently within like a 2 minute time frame? Then was I able to get 5 second, 10 second holds, all those sort of things? And I did certainly reach my goal. I'm very happy and content with that. And what I wanted to do as a result of this episode, considering I haven't done a podcast in quite a while, was to really summarize the 28 days, a lot of the insights, a lot of the things that I did across the 28 days, and some of the more important things about the handstand. You'll see if you follow me on social media that basically prior to the challenge itself, I set myself a little bit of accountability by saying, okay, I'm going to mention it to my social media following, so then I'm checking in on a regular basis. But in doing so, I realized like, oh yeah, there's benefit, of course, for me to be able to teach on a lot of this stuff, which is an area that I want to get into in terms of teaching more of a movement focused practice. Handstands are a part of that. Some people want to work on it, some people don't. But for me anyway, it was a realization, as I said, that as part of a lot of the acrobatic maneuvers, spending time on my hands, having an ability to balance overhead just gives you more confidence in a lot of these movements where you're not just falling over, you know how to control the body to some degree. So that's really what handstands were to give me and why I'm working on them. I know if you're close to me in terms of our practice, you know that I hate handstands. Personally, I have a bit of a hatred for them. Just never really found the want and desire to go and do them. So that's one of the funny parts for me that I realize, like, oh yeah, there's probably, there's a lot of things that I don't necessarily enjoy or like within my training, but I know I should go and do them. So that's part of the reason probably why I wasn't putting as much time and effort into handstands. So that's why I knew the 28 days was going to be really good for me. So what I ended up doing, as I said then, was bringing a few people on board, making it a bit of a free challenge and just saying, hey, I'm going to do this 28 days myself. Come on board, whatever your level is, whether you're a beginner, whether you have handstands yourself and you're just looking to work on them. That was really the goal and intention. So going into it, I knew there was going to be a mixed bag of people. And for me anyway, that really gave me an opportunity to scale things back and to say to myself, like, oh yeah, what are the kind of key important things that I know of already, but need to be communicated to an absolute beginner, kind of starting off with the journey itself and then scaling up in terms of the volume of work. I was able to go into the 28 days and say to myself, oh yeah, I probably, I could have very easily scaled it, that I had more intense days and lower intense days where I could have spent exactly some time on my hands, whereas someone coming into it for the first time probably doesn't have the strength and tolerance to that sort of work with their wrists and shoulders and elbows, the main sort of structures that are going to keep you solid and steady during a handstand. The capacity just isn't there yet. And the goal then with the 28 days was to really build someone up to from a beginner to a more advanced stage. Even those who were maybe more advanced were still going to get some practical elements and some applicable things from the beginner stage. At least that was the way in which I wanted to structure it. So handful of people joined me across the 28 days, which was great. There was lots of insights. I'll certainly let you know what those are as we go through. But basically that was my goal from the start, was to really assess what people's kind of level was. And from that, it gave us an opportunity to say, okay, if you're at more of a beginner, intermediate, or advanced level, here are the things that you're really going to focus on within the early stages. And to me, what it meant for a beginner was they had to be really aware of the wrists, shoulders, and the amount of work that they were doing on them. So starting off, whether or not that person had a lot of experience with hand balancing or with any acrobatic maneuvers, I was saying to them, okay, look, you're probably more of a beginner at this stuff. So we just need to be super aware of the amount of days we do in succession. If we do 2 to 3 days on the trot where you're trying to balance overhead, it can be quite tough on the shoulders. So you need to be aware of that going forward in terms of potentially scaling things back where necessary. And certainly adding in, like what I intended to do was take a few days where you weren't actually spending time on the wrists so that you could give them a bit of a rest, but you'd also still work on them. You could still work on the mobility. You could still work on the strength around the wrists without putting too much of your weight on them, and work around the shoulders, the elbows, alignment, all those sort of things that are really relevant to the handstand. So you still feel as if you're certainly doing work that's dedicated towards the handstand, but you're not necessarily overloading the structure. You're giving it enough time. These are just some basic considerations in terms of the person's level and what they should do going forward. So certainly for you, if you're listening to this episode and thinking to yourself, well, what sort of level would I find myself at and how do I go about starting handstands, then perfect. This is the sort of stuff that's relevant for you going forward in terms of understanding how you start the journey itself. Then it was into more intermediate people where, they potentially have done some work on handstands in the past, but they're just maybe not getting it very consistent holds. And that's how I would kind of term myself. I'd certainly term myself as more of an intermediate person. What it meant for me then was not that wrists and shoulder mobility and strength around those areas are of a concern, but they weren't going to limit me massively in the practice. And as long as I just went about things in a smart manner, then I was going to be fine, not doing a crazy amount of work throughout the 28 days, but just enough to kind of keep things going, give myself enough time in terms of rest and recovery, knowing that they weren't the things that were really going to limit me. And I think what that highlights really for a beginner person is they're not necessarily going to find a lot of the handstand work useless. Like, certainly don't think that, but because of the wrists and shoulders being such of a limiting factor, they become the things that maybe become such a primary focus within the early stages. I took it as sort of a 28-day period to start at a beginner, work your way up to a more advanced level, but that could have been scaled out. And I think that's what I'm going to do going forward in terms of potentially offering a handstand program or something like that, or how I teach people going forward with handstands, is to really get that level initially. Of course, I wouldn't just throw someone into those advanced options initially, and that's why we started off that way with the handstand journey. But I suppose by the end was some of the beginner people, you can understand a little bit of frustration and thinking that why amn't I progressing on to these more advanced variations that I was giving across. But the thing that I was trying to communicate was, hey, look, if you're at that beginner level, don't get frustrated. You have to start at this point and see yourself progress through to the point that you can then work to more of the intermediate stuff. And while I'm giving the advanced stuff, it didn't necessarily mean that you weren't making progress. And I think once that's established, you start to realize, like, oh yeah, I am starting to feel a better connection to the hands. I am starting to feel like the shoulders are opening up. Like when I get into some of these positions, like I actually have a little bit more control. So it's just about getting to that point where you assess and say, okay, this is my current level. This is what I'm to expect across the handstand journey, and not necessarily just achieving it within a 28-day period. I think if someone was to achieve it within the 28-day period, they would have had some work potentially done in the handstand or something related to it. That's one way to think of it. So that's really what we were trying to get out of giving the levels initially, and why we worked through them so quickly. And it meant for me then, it was certainly more directed towards someone like myself, someone that could get in straight away, get consistency with a lot of these variations that are going to obviously help with achieving those sort of consistent handstand holds. And I'm going to certainly go into what those things look like in more detail, but I certainly thought that was an important distinction to make early on within this podcast, in terms of giving you all the insights and details of what happened during the challenge. So across the 28 days, we discussed some various things that were obviously really, really important for a handstand in terms of achieving one. And one of those things I think that's really important is understanding what is alignment. Now, you might understand, if you've ever seen a handstand before, how when someone goes up and performs one pretty correctly, what that looks like. You can see they're pretty much stacked. So you'll see it where the hands will really dictate where the body then orients itself. It's not to say that more advanced practitioners don't play around with these things, and for sure that comes in due time. But for me, the aim was obviously understanding my own level and saying to myself, okay, I need to get just a handstand, so I need to kind of abide by some very basic rules. But then as time goes on, realizing that those rules are actually very flexible and can be played with, and they're not necessarily set in stone. So I think realizing that was important, and saying to ourselves, okay, what does optimal alignment look like, so that you can kind of start off and get your very consistent holds and then progress on. So what that looked like in terms of optimal alignment, you'd say to yourself, like a gymnastics handstand would be a very, very good starting point for a lot of people. So what that looks like is you're saying to yourself, okay, very, very rigid confinement in terms of where you position everything. So you'd say to yourself that your hands should somewhat be directly underneath your shoulders. So if you were to just stand up tall and raise your arms up overhead, that's pretty much the distance that you want to think with your hands for your handstand. And that sets you up so that you're not too wide, that you're putting like excess strain on a certain area, not too narrow that you wouldn't even be able to sort of press with the shoulders at all. It's just a very basic guideline, and just saying, okay, perfect, that's what you want to look like. You would also look at locking out the elbows. If I go through basically like joint by joint what they should look like, this is what you want to think, but I'll give you two things at the end that sort of help, I think, better think about it in your own mind. Like when you're in the middle of a handstand, you don't want to be thinking, okay, what is every single aspect of the body, like every single joint doing? It's just too much information to really even filter or think about. So what you're really thinking about during the handstand is kind of like one or two little things for alignment, but what that alignment actually translates to then is these basic things at a joint by joint level. So as I said, hands directly underneath the shoulders, like when you're upside down, obviously that's what it equates to. So the hands go directly underneath the shoulders and you lock the elbows. Now there are a few sort of opinions where you might try to rotate the armpits of the elbows like forward, but that to me can be quite tough to think about initially. I just almost want you to think of locking out the elbows, because when you bend the elbows, you often find that you're probably not going to find it easy to balance between both hands and shoulders. Those are kind of the two main points that you end up balancing from. And when you have the elbows bent, it's almost like there's too much strain being put on it. You want the elbow to act as sort of the arm in general really to act as like a pillar. So that's why you'll try to keep the elbow locked, and that gives you a much better position to play from. Shoulders then, in some way what you're trying to think is the shoulders try to sit directly underneath the hands. Now obviously balancing during the handstand changes that, but that's really what optimal alignment will end up looking like, where the shoulders are directly underneath the wrists, maybe is a better way to think of it. What you end up finding then is good alignment would also look as if the ribs are tucked down. You're not excessively flaring the spine, the ribs. You'd have the ribs down to some degree. And then you'd also look at what the pelvic position would look like. So if you're aware of the two pelvic movements, you have sort of the basic plane of anterior and posterior tilting. This is where, if you think about it as your belt buckle, you were to say belt buckle either rotated towards your face or belt buckle rotated away from you. And you can imagine that gives you kind of a duck back posture. Not the best to really learn handstands initially. And I think that's what I was stuck in for quite a while, was I wasn't really aware of my pelvis, or I wasn't focusing on it too much. And as a result, I was getting into this real big banana shape. and it makes it very hard to balance from. As I said though, banana handstand shape can be achieved, but it's certainly to be considered a more advanced movement to play around with when you have a basic handstand. Um, so belt buckle would be rotated towards your face then. So what that gives you really from the anterior side, the front side of the body, is a lot more of a connection and awareness of your um, trunk and core, if you want to think about it in that way. The anterior side, the front side of the body, you'll get a lot more tension and you'll be able to control your balance a lot more from there for sure. We don't want to think of the body excessively during the handstand. That's why when we say these things in alignment, we say to ourselves, okay, cool, work on these from the beginning so that they're not like too conscious of a thought down the road. They just become the thing that gets you're in position, you get good alignment straight away. You don't really have to worry about it. What you might find then is as you progress with your handstands or as you start to work on them, you might video yourself and then come back and look at yourself and go, oh wait, I'm way out of alignment. I'm not really finding that good posture with my trunk. So that's why I'm potentially finding it so hard to actually balance when I'm up in the handstand itself. The legs, once again, you don't want to be putting too much emphasis on like thinking about each joint, but usually what you want to find is the knees are locked for sure. Extending, maybe even potentially squeezing your quads if that helps. And then your toes would be somewhat pointed towards the ceiling. Now, as I said, not rules that are set in concrete, but they help us get things initially in a good position. Now, as I said, there's a lot to go through there as I went through joint by joint, but something that I find helps better is to really focus on 2 to 3 things. You might focus on first when you think of alignment. Obviously, we said the setting up in terms of the hands directly underneath the shoulders. That's not necessarily one that I want you to think. What I want you to think in terms of the 3 sort of main ones is pressing the shoulders away or pressing the floor away. That gets you active and aware through your upper body. You also then want to think of pointing the toes towards the sky and also like reaching towards the sky. So that gets this nice length through the body as opposed to feeling very compressed on yourself where you're not really getting that length and opportunity to kind of course correct. If you're really, really compressed, it actually makes it quite hard to balance and correct. When you have length, you have enough structure there to be able to play around with the various like subtleties of balance. So getting length, you'll find as you go throughout a handstand journey is really, really important. So that's why I really want to emphasize those 2 points. Pressing the floor away, like you'll feel as if you're sort of like pressing your armpits up, your shoulders will sort of shrug in some way. You'll be way more active through that part of the body, but then also then reaching the toes towards the ceiling and getting that length. The other thing that certainly becomes relevant, and it's to relate back to what I was saying about that duck back posture, is for me anyway, this was really important. It might not necessarily be for you, but that idea of the pelvic tilt or the belt buckle rotating towards your face. So when I was doing handstands, I wasn't necessarily focusing on what am I doing at the wrist, what am I doing at the elbow, what am I doing at this. I was thinking of those sort of 3 things, and to me, those 3 things were an easy enough thing to keep in mind when I was doing them as my guiding principles for alignment for me anyway. So those were really things that we emphasized a lot at the start. When you're advanced, you're certainly considering those things. You might not even have been aware of them as the main things to focus on. So that's where you were gaining a lot of benefit potentially from looking at those things in isolation. And certainly for beginners, we were saying like, okay, think about these things in question, work on various positions where you're focusing on these points so that you're not getting yourself up into a handstand and finding you're just all over the place with the body. Because in time, what then happens is, as I said, once that becomes very conscious initially, it almost becomes unconscious going forward. You don't actually have to think about the body too much. You then put your emphasis somewhere else in terms of learning how to balance, how to course correct from there. Okay, and I'll get to that a little bit later about what that is. One thing that we also looked at that was really important at the start was understanding your fear of falling. To me, this is a really important thing that I could certainly go on to a lot of detail about. I want to just touch on it briefly here, just to make sure that we get through everything that we sort of saw as relevant for a good handstand. But really what limits people at the start in terms of getting up to a good handstand and being confident there, especially when you're on your own, is how to fall properly or just understanding where that fear actually comes from. Because obviously we're very used to balancing with our feet. We're not necessarily used to balancing with our hands. Just give me one quick second. I need to get the laptop back up so I have my notes in front of me. So we obviously feel comfortable balancing on our feet. Our head is very much used to being where it is when we're standing. Whereas when we flip ourselves upside down, it's suddenly new territory that we're not used to spending a lot of time in. You'd argue that 99.9% of your life you're going to spend in this plane, in this orientation of your body. And then the minute you flip yourself upside down, it's kind of like, well, what the hell is going on? Your sight is kind of completely flipped. So how do you gain balance and know where you are in space? And that's a really huge thing for your brain and for your nervous system. So that brings up a lot of fear. So when people start with handstands, you suddenly find yourself potentially doing variations where you're against the wall. And the minute you come away from the wall, it's almost as if your body doesn't give you a chance to build some experience where fear isn't just directing the ship. You'll get up into that position and straight away you'll lose contact with the wall, and fear will just tell you, get back onto the wall. You haven't even got an opportunity to potentially play with things or have an intent for the movement that you're in the middle of. Fear has just taken over completely. So a lot of the time, starting off, getting over that fear or playing with the fear is really, really important. The way we looked at it was, if we have what is considered known territory, that's our comfort zone. We're comfortable here. But then on the outskirts of that, what we find is we find ourselves in what would be considered maybe an uncomfortable zone. It's not that this area is necessarily known territory. It's partly unknown. And we can consider this things that are just outside our scope of possibility right now, whether that be from a movement perspective or even a cognitive perspective. Things that we grasp and we understand that are somewhat unknown, we're struggling to understand and we're struggling to contend with. Those become things that we really have to direct our focus, direct our attention before we fully see it as a known thing, something that we're really, really confident with even communicating. When we think of things that are outside our comprehension, we dance around things and we struggle to explain it. But when we really understand something, when we're really confident with it, we can explain it with ease. So then you go into what would be considered, as I said, the comfort zone, which is known territory. You then go into that period or that area of uncomfortable zone, is one way to think of it. And then you go into just almost like a fear zone. And the fear zone really is where you just have very little experience, but you can certainly gain the experience. That's where various things can seem completely outside of our scope of possibility. You look at someone like a free climber. A lot of people would say, hell no to something like that. You just go, I am not going anywhere near that. But you can understand the steps and procedures in the way up to that. You would start off by climbing. You would have yourself with lots of harnesses. You would start off at very lower heights, even heights that if you actually fell from, you wouldn't feel too bad, and you can have comforts there. Or mattresses there. You can have spotters, and you can see how you could scale your way up to the point that you're potentially doing a free solo climb. Not saying that everyone has to go and do that to conquer fear, but you can understand where I've gone with that in terms of scaling your way up. So really what I was trying to communicate was that brief period of kind of the uncomfortable is really, really important to flirt with that line, to find yourself trying movements that are somewhat challenging, somewhat known, but they're tough, and I was exposing people to various positions where there's varying degrees of stability and support to perform. Even having a person with you to spot you gives you that comfort of building ease in a handstand, because you know that even if you fall, that person is there to grab you. A good spotter will be able to just grab you, make you feel comfortable, so that the minute you felt as if you were about to fall over, you'd be fine. But obviously then we had to build that up in terms of knowing that some people didn't have a spotter and were just doing this at home, so they needed various different supports. So that's where it was really important to look at what is fear and gradually expose ourselves to those positions and just try to deal with it in various different ways. Go about it in terms of various different practical things that we could do, viewing it, visualizing it, breathing, focusing on it in different ways, and trying to navigate our way around this sort of uncharted territory, which was really, really important in terms of gaining some confidence with the handstand. What that also led to was a kind of a highlighting of the importance of learning how to exit a handstand. We focused on one specific variation here. And with this comes the confidence then of knowing that the minute you take yourself away from the wall, you're able to get out of a handstand with ease. And I think the reason why I'm highlighting this is it's such an important part as a beginner to get good at, to work on alignment and to work on your exits. So that as you start to get up to freestanding handstands, you know that every time you get up, regardless of whether or not you can actually hold yourself up there, you can exit simply. You know exactly what to do. It's certainly not unknown territory. There's certainly no fear attached to it, and you can get out of it with ease. Because for me, it was a case of, oh yeah, I don't have that because I was exposed to acrobatics before I was necessarily exposed to handstands. So it was like, oh yeah, every time I go into a handstand, I'm confident because I can do cartwheels, and I can do various variations of cartwheels where the minute I'm up there and I fall, whether it be behind myself, in front of myself, whatever way it is, I know where to orient myself and get out of it quite comfortably. So certainly working on that, certainly exposing yourself to those variations is going to be important when you begin a handstand. Other things, we touched on this already in terms of the wrist and shoulder prep. This is something I was saying was really, really important for beginners, so I'm not going to touch on it too much, but really understanding and saying to yourself, like, oh yeah, like, I mean, when I think about starting my handstand journey, and just even starting acrobatics in general, there was a period where it was just like I was so aware of my wrists. It's really hard to explain. It's just you suddenly build this awareness of, oh yeah, I'm very weak at this specific thing with my wrist. I could have done, throughout my years of experience, I've done bicep curls, I've done arm work, I've done pull-ups, I've done various different things, and you'd say to yourself like, oh yeah, my wrists are strong. Like I did like kickboxing and stuff like that. So I have expected my wrists to be somewhat strong and confident and capable that they were able to do stuff. But the minute I started acrobatic maneuvers, it's like, oh yeah, you're stressing the wrists in a very specific way and putting all your weight through them. So getting time under my belt in just that very specific thing was really necessary over my journey with handstands. Not necessarily just the 28 days, but just almost the 2 years that I've really been focusing on them like really, I say focusing on them, I mean like having them in my practice to some degree. So early on, I worked on the mobility around my wrists, making sure that they actually felt okay getting into that position. And only now do I feel that I'm like, oh yeah, I'm not really aware of my wrists at all. Whereas at that time, when I first started doing them, as I said, it's hard to describe in some sense. It was just a constant awareness of, oh yes, I've been doing stuff with my wrists, not only during my practice, but just throughout the day. Randomly, I was just like, oh yeah, my wrists feel different. So understanding the strength that comes in time is really important. And to touch on that as well in terms of the insights that were gained from people who took part, it was such a noticeable thing. It's like, oh yeah, like the basic wrist work improved dramatically from the start, and such an awareness of small little subtleties of the wrists and of balancing on the hands. It's great that that's identified early on and something to work on outside of just the handstand itself specifically. So we're looking at the thing that's obviously our focus, but working on it in these other areas, these things that are obviously important for it. And that's why I wanted to just touch on them and say that wrists, shoulder prep, those things are super important going forward. One thing then as well, I'm just going to play around with some of the bits of technology beside me and make sure that this laptop doesn't go dead on me. One thing that I want to highlight more specifically then is what's considered cambered hands, and how we actually balance during a handstand. So we've gone through some very basic stuff there. We've said to ourselves like this idea of alignment, exiting a handstand, wrist and shoulder prep, those important things that might be relevant to work on at the start for a beginner for sure. But you start to get to a point where you start to realize like, okay, where do I actually like balance from in a handstand? What should my focus be? And from my experience and from what I've read into in terms of my research initially into handstands before the challenge had started, my experience gained from teachers, and various people who are obviously more experienced in hand balancing, like Cirque du Soleil artists that, that's their thing. They do lots of different things from one arm handstand. What you'll hear oftentimes is most of the balancing, like where you balance from, will be from the hands. So when I was saying earlier, this idea of understanding, like locking the elbows and being really, really specific with your wrist and your shoulder position, is you put yourself in that position of alignment so that you can then have the wrists be the point that you direct your attention to when you're trying to balance or rebalance in a handstand. So when you kick up and when you get yourself into good alignment, how you then manage things from there in terms of the little subtleties of correction of balance is your hands. Your hands are going to be the big thing. Your fingers, maybe another way to think of it. You'll find those little like the dexterity that is the hand. Like we're very aware of that when we're riding or something like that, like how different it is, say, between like our good hand and our bad hand. We understand like, oh yeah, I can move my hand in very subtle, delicate ways. And that's what you end up doing then in the handstand, is because of that dexterity within our hands. When you look at the homunculus, how the brain is mapped, and you see how much space in terms of the brain is dedicated towards the hands, you'll see it's a huge part. That's in some way why it's easy to, or why we should look at balancing from the hands. But you'll find that there's sort of there's maybe too much emphasis on the idea of like gaining your balance potentially even from the torso or from the shoulders a lot of the times with handstand. It's not that you can't rebalance from those areas. It's just majority of the time it needs to come from the hands, really. And that's where the idea of the homunculus brain is so important, because we already have so much brain space really dedicated towards the hands, and we can go through those very, very subtle corrections in balance. Like that's what we usually find during a handstand, is it's subtle corrections. It's not these huge adjustments in our balance. It's delicate little adjustments that when you find balance, you're just responding to potentially where you've gone off balance, and you're going for those little course corrections. And that's what the cambered hands really gives us an option to. If you've never seen a cambered hand, the idea is if the hand was flat on the floor, you would almost have, not necessarily where the knuckle is, but the first sort of bit then after the knuckle, you'd have that elevated. You'd have that part off the ground as if you were sort of gripping the ground with the fingers a little bit. So you'd have, not necessarily, as I said, the knuckle of the hand raised, but that first little middle knuckle maybe is one way to think of it. You'd have that raised. So that gives you an option to, once again, feel the ground, really direct your consciousness or direct your emphasis in terms of your balance towards the hands. You'll find that if you just kind of like you certainly splay the hands, like you spread them, like if you were to think of your hands normally as like together, or your fingers together, you would ideally try to splay them initially, so you'd have your hand kind of widely spread as much as possible, and then you'd go for that cambered hand where that middle sort of knuckle is raised up. And that just puts you in a better position to play around with your balance. You'd certainly see that as prevalent among hand balancers. But you'll notice it yourself if you try to get into a handstand and you just splay the fingers and have them all of the finger in contact. You can't really make those subtle changes. Whereas if you go for that cambered hand with that knuckle raised, you'll find it much easier to play around with. So super important thing that I thought was relevant along the journey is understanding the cambered hand and where we balance from. And as I said, probably 95% of the balancing is going to come from the hands when you're up there and when you're working on them. Sometimes you find that overcorrection happening or overbalancing where you do need to move more through the shoulders and less through the hands, but you're always going to be aware of the hands as you're in the handstand. So certainly keep that in mind. One thing that comes up, and this is where we get into more of the intermediate things with handstands of when we're actually up in the handstand itself and becoming aware of some of the things that we're doing, is how we're breathing. And this was a really funny thing for me, because as you start to get into more long duration holds, is you start to become aware of, oh yeah, like I'm holding my breath and I'm doing myself in terms of going for those longer holds. Like you'll know yourself, if you get up there and you're going for like 10, 15, 20-second holds, you can't just hold your breath throughout that whole time. Like it's a strenuous thing. You need to get air into you. You need to exhale out all the CO2 that you're producing. So you become aware of that in time. You have to focus and say, oh yeah, even for those short sort of 4 or 5-second holds, try to let the air out, try to inhale again, try to focus on your breathing. One way of doing this is even counting out loud, and that way at least you know, like, oh yeah, if I count out like 1, 2, 3, my seconds that I'm holding it for, you're not just holding your breath. It's a funny little trick that you can play with. One more thing, I suppose, when you're up in the handstand, the idea of your sight as well is maybe another thing that you can play with. And this is maybe going into more advanced things where you would actually start to look in various different places and you would try to be almost like loose with the head. For me anyway, starting off and just getting to the point that I was getting more consistent with my holds, was rather than thinking of having my eye line, say, between my hands, like if I were to pick a spot dead on the floor, I would almost look a little bit past the wrist. So if I were to direct my gaze more towards my fingers or more towards my wrist, I would be directing them down a little bit, like a midpoint between them, a little bit past the wrists on the floor, so that I'm not putting excessive strain on my neck, like I'm not, back in this really extended posture. That helped me certainly when it came to the balancing aspect. Suddenly I played around with that and I'm like, oh, this feels much easier to balance from here, because you're not so like extended with the neck, almost like looking towards the fingers. Other things that I thought were really important throughout the journey, and this maybe comes down to the element of programming that we were going through, was I was trying to expose ourselves to as much different variations as possible, because at the end you often notice is, for me anyway, was there were certain things that I personally needed to work on that I was finding was quite poor. Like, for example, my ability to do kick-ups into a handstand were quite poor. And it's not to say that I couldn't have worked on other areas, it's just it was a notable thing for me. So what we tried to do then was for the handstand, and it's certainly an area that I feel is really good from the teaching aspect of this work, to realize like, oh yeah, this is important for me, but there are going to be loads of different things that come up for various different people. So giving them their due time and saying like, okay, as someone that's teaching on this material, you start to look at it in new different ways, realizing what you've mastered as a result of the handstand and still need to work on. But then how do you communicate that to people in a broad different way? It gives you a better understanding of what it is that you're actually doing. You're not just sort of blindly trudging or going forward with your work. You're starting to reflect on it and say, oh yeah, these things that I've sort of glanced over maybe and not seen as relevant are really, really relevant. So how do you communicate that? How do you get it across in the best manner? And that's what I was trying to do with a lot of the different variations, was bringing attention to the exact intent that you were kind of going for when you were doing a different variation. Whether it was like half L holds against the wall with it behind you or in front of you, how you were getting off the wall, where the balancing and everything like that was coming from. And that's a more direct insight into how the programming operated, where we were trying to expose ourselves to a lot of these different variations and then highlighted and said to ourselves like, okay, where did you notice yourself kind of performing poorly? And able to identify those things and say, okay, these are probably the things that you should be working on as you go forward to really master your handstand, because those are the things that are just going to limit you going forward. And this brings it even back to that beginner, intermediate, and advanced level. You say to yourself like, oh yeah, I'm not aware of my hands at all. So bringing more focused attention and more direct variations that really work on your hands is going to be super important for you. So covering a broad range of things, but then also bringing it back to the point that we started to personalize and get very specific with the work that we were doing. I also highlight the idea of recording yourself. Now, I think this is just relevant to everyone within training, like not necessarily just handstands. And I highlight this a lot of the time when people start working with me is you need to get into a good habit of recording yourself. Like when I think about it, I have thousands of videos of myself from training, like over the years that I've done it. I started off 10 plus years ago, and when I go through like my photo library, I've got loads of those videos still there that I can go back on. And that's what gives you another perspective, another way of viewing things, that you actually realize, like, from those, how much you start to coach yourself. I obviously have a very specific position in terms of my experience, that I'm able to coach myself a little bit more than a normal person who's coming into this with no experience. But you start to identify, obviously, the things that I'm trying to teach, that you may feel you're performing quite well. Like when you say to yourself, like, oh yeah, I'm in good alignment and I have my hands directly on your shoulders and blah, 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 all those various things that I mentioned. But then when you record yourself, you suddenly realize, like, oh, I'm way too angled against the wall or away from the wall, or I'm not locked out with my elbows. I didn't really notice that. It felt like I was locked out. So this is where recording yourself is really, really important. And something that I'd highlight to anyone really going forward is get into a good habit of doing that and starting to develop a very keen eye, a coaching eye almost, so that you can start to play around with those things. And that will massively accelerate your training going forward. I promise this. Like when you start to record and when you start to develop more of a coaching eye, you identify things straight away and you go, oh yeah, this is 100% one of the issues why I'm potentially not doing something well. As opposed to just going weeks and weeks of going, no, that feels fine, like that feels grand. It's like, it's just not there. It's definitely something that needs attention that you could have identified weeks ago, months ago. You never know. So keep that in mind, not just necessarily for handstands, but a lot of the work that you do going forward. Okay. One thing that I thought was really important to mention was, and this is maybe more direct insights from me, not just others that go about handstands. I'm sure everyone comes to this when they go across handstands, is learning to be patient with handstands, or anything really when it comes to your movement practice. You are certainly going to find days where you are not getting things, or you think you should have made more progress. I think even the second episode of this podcast was me saying how important really patience is in the journey, and that was when I started with handstands, and I needed to be humbled. Like I had done lots of work in various areas, and I thought I should be able to get a handstand very quickly. And obviously, it being like 2 years into the handstand work, you've got to be patient. Like you've got to obviously understand where you are, focus on the work at hand, all of those sort of things, but not get too frustrated with how you're getting on with things. It's more important that you take those steps on a consistent basis than the actual progress that you make. Because for me anyway, what I find is progress really comes in leaps and bounds. Like when you progress through things in a very quick manner, you're often progressing to the point of your previous capabilities. Some people come into handstands and get them straight away and happy days. That's really great, and it's often down to maybe previous work that they've done or experience or ways in which they've practiced in the past. But for me, it was just not happening as quickly as I wanted to. So I was impatient in terms of what I wanted to get out of the handstand, and that hindered me focusing on it at the time, because I was like, fuck it. Like, I'm not making any progress with it, so I'm just going to move on to other things. And could I have sped things up a little bit? Would I have a handstand by now if I was more patient? Definitely. Like, I would have worked more diligently and consistently with the handstand, recognized my position and where I'm at, recognized what I need to work on, and I would have been further along the way. But I'm not necessarily looking back and saying, oh, if only I could have done this. It's just an awareness of, oh yeah, patience or impatience will come up all the time. You'll be frustrated in terms of the overall journey, or you'll be frustrated in terms of the day-to-day. Because for me, what happens on a regular basis is, I go in, and we've made a joke about this before, me and other friends and other colleagues and people within handstand in the movement practice or doing handstands, working on handstands, is sometimes you go in and, you feel fantastic. Shoulders feel really good, wrists feel really good. You're well recovered, you're well rested, and you go, lovely, I'm going to do loads of handstands today and they're going to be great. And they end up being shit. You don't get one consistent hold. You just feel off, you just feel terrible. You go in another day, your wrists are all beat up, you're tired and fatigued from the training load, you haven't slept well, you haven't had a good feed beforehand, you're going in tired, drained, and you go, these are going to be terrible. You go in and you get a PR. You get the most time that you've ever done in a handstand, or they just feel perfect. You get that balance point, and there's no question about it. They feel amazing. And you kind of say, like, what the hell is going on? And you kind of just have to allow yourself to be in that space and recognize that the progress isn't going to be just straight linear. You're not just going to suddenly be like, oh yeah, I've got a 2-second handstand and I can do that 5 times in the session. Now I can do 3 seconds. Now I can do 5 seconds, and blah, 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 blah. It's going to be an up and down battle on some days. And it's just saying to yourself, like, cool, perfect. The good days are good. The bad days are bad. But it's more about how can I keep the thing moving forward, so that eventually that just becomes the place in which you are. You're at a place where your inconsistency or your poor days are a 30-second handstand. And when you're feeling great, suddenly it's a 60-second handstand, or even potentially working towards a one arm or your other variations. That's just what happens, is things just move in that general direction. And when you are consistent like that with something, that's where things move in those leaps and bounds. You're working, and it almost feels like you're plateauing because you're just working so specifically on these one or two things that aren't really jumping in terms of progress. But what you'll find is sometimes you just make those leaps, and it's crazy when they happen because they're hard to really they're hard to communicate to people sometimes, because it's almost like you're pulling someone's leg. It's like, oh no, like I'm telling you, you're gonna just make leaps and bounds in no time. And weeks go by and you're like, what do you mean I'm gonna make leaps and bounds in no time? Like, I've been doing something for 4 weeks straight and I haven't made any progress. But that's honestly what happens sometimes. Like, sometimes you just find yourself at a point where things just start to really be directed towards something. You've put so much effort into directing the body in a certain way, or directing yourself in a certain way, and that consistency, just suddenly the body goes, okay, this is what you've wanted me to do this whole time, here you go. And it's not like one session got you there. It was that massive backlog of all the work that you've done on this area, on this thing, that suddenly just went, it just transformed, and it just spun the opposite way and just went, yep, cool, we've got this now. Like, you've well and truly laid the foundations for something. And that's what happens with handstands for sure. Like, when I think of it, when I started off with the handstands, by the end I was obviously at a certain level. Now I'm feeling much more consistent with that balancing aspect, or that getting into balance. Like, when I was doing my kick-ups initially, it was like, it was almost like a hope and a prayer that I had as to whether I would actually get it. Whereas now I bring myself up into those positions and I'm there straight away. Whether or not it's 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds is still to be seen on those certain days, but it's there, and I know it's there for sure. So that's where I just keep needing to push it along in a certain direction, and then I know suddenly it's just going to be, boom, there it is, a like perfectly aligned handstand to things that I've done previously. Like, when I put up a video the other day of kind of my progress near the end, it's understanding now that the goalpost has moved. It's like, yep, I've achieved what I wanted to achieve by the end of the 28 days by saying to myself I wanted to get very consistent holds, certain duration holds, over setting myself like a time limit. And I've got that. Now it's working on, okay, making the alignment look better, potentially going into different variations, which I am going into at the moment. Seeing it as like, oh yeah, it wasn't really about getting the handstand, it was what the handstand now opens me up to doing. Other handstand variations, more confidence in my acrobatics, and everything like that I obviously have in my practice. So an important thing that I think is so relevant, not necessarily just to handstands, but to a movement practice in general, and to life in general, really, is that patience thing of, If you want to work on it, if you want to get it, be consistent with it. Don't focus too much on the results. Focus on where you're at right now, what needs to be done, how much you can tolerate on a consistent basis, and just put the head down. As simple as that. Go after it, get the work done, and you will 100% make those leaps and bounds that I was talking about. Not to go on too long, I'm very aware of the time of how long as this has been. I'm hoping you've made it to this point because you've been interested in working on your handstand or want to delve into this area and wanted to understand what it is that's so relevant as part of the process. Hopefully that has really summarized everything to a great degree and you've got lots from that episode. For me, it was something that I recognized after the last podcast episode I did, I think was at the end of May. So it's been quite a while. We've been shooting June, and a week or so. We're now I'm recording this on the 4th of July. So what's happened in that time was near the end of May was when I was in Vienna. I was back to the movement school with Marcello to see everyone, to kind of say goodbye to everyone. As I'd kind of said, I think I'd mentioned on a previous episode that I got COVID around the time that I left the last time. So didn't get to see as many people. So it was great to actually head back for a few days to see people again, to say proper goodbyes. You know, everyone obviously has a direction that they're going now. The school is sort of transforming in some way in terms of how Marcello is structuring things. The group in Vienna is somewhat dispersing, but there's a solid group of people that are still going to keep up the practice and stay somewhat related to his work for sure. So it's great to see, as a result, you know, everyone involved has a decision to make, you know, a direction in which they want to go. And it's fascinating to see what everyone has got from the practice and how it's directing their decision making going forward. So for me, it gave me an opportunity to kind of obviously get back into that space with everyone and to bring as much awareness to the situation as possible to maybe realize what was coming up. And for me, it was very, very interesting being back in that setting. You know, I came back to Ireland where a movement community isn't part of my everyday as it was when I was in Vienna. And how that period away from the school went and was going to now then being with the group again, to now being back in Ireland, you know, having that brief period to go like, oh yeah, as a reflective exercise, it's very interesting to see like, oh yeah, what are the things here within the movement school that are really great that I almost want to bring to my life going forward away from Vienna, back home in Ireland, in Bray, in close to Dublin. And what were the things that were kind of coming up? As I said, I wanted to be as conscious as possible during that time to realize like what's the potential, what's going forward, what can I cultivate myself in my own practice and with a group. So one thing that was coming up was there was a handful of people that I hadn't met that were only just starting off in the group while I had been gone. You know, I left in January, so there was a lot of new people to meet, to ask questions, to understand what the practice is to them and how they got here and on all that sort of stuff. What that meant then was reoccurring questions coming up. And one of the reoccurring questions was, what's the movement scene like in Ireland? Or where I'm from, where I'm staying, all that sort of stuff. And it made me reflect. It made me realize that like, oh yeah, there's not really much of a movement scene community, like a practice in Ireland. You know, there's people that I know from Ireland that are involved in it, but you often don't see much of a community. So to me, that really highlighted, you know, when I came back, I had more of this focus on potentially doing something online, and I still do stuff online, but it's then saying, okay, well, what is the balance of stuff that I'm going to do? And to me, it's now a realization of like, oh yeah, I did this handstand challenge online, and it's given me a certain perspective of saying, okay, how do I teach a lot of this material going forward? What's the structure that I want to do with it? And what does teaching something like this really mean in terms of a group? And that's what I want to do going forward is have an in-person group. And whether or not it's the main thing, of course, it's going to direct a lot of my time. But I think given my experience with groups as well, it's really a place to test or to experiment. And that's really important. That's where new discoveries are made within the experimentation process. Like when I think back to when I had the small groups in Clonski, when I was operating Square One Coaching as more of a small group personal training gym, it was fantastic. I had this opportunity where I had multiple people in front of me with various levels of skill, and I was teaching, let's say, for example, deadlift was one of the movements for the day. I got super, super experienced at teaching the deadlift because I wasn't just seeing, say, like one person do it for the hour that I was doing where it was like private training. I was seeing, upwards of 4 people per hour for 5 or 6 sessions a day. And suddenly you get this opportunity of, oh yeah, here's how you adjust it for this issue, that issue, whatever it is. And it was just such a condensed exposure to what it is that I was teaching at the time, the material and work that I was teaching. So now going forward, it's an opportunity bringing multiple things together for me. For me, it's about bringing together and creating more of a movement community in Ireland, in Dublin, in Wicklow, whatever that may be. And going forward, what that means as how I teach the stuff as well is it a case where I just have a group of people where it's more of a movement practice? It's obviously we're all developing and testing these different areas and growing in certain ways, exposing ourselves to material, or is it more of a school? The way I think I'm probably more leaning towards is I'm creating this material, teaching it on so that it becomes a more condensed thing that I understand and comprehend. Like what I was saying with taking that new perspective of handstands at the start was, oh yeah, some of these things are just kind of second nature to me, or they're almost unconsciously guided things. So how do I bring that back to explain it to someone, teach it on to someone that doesn't maybe have this in their mind or in the back of their mind all the time? So that's where an in-person group for me going forward is going to be super important. I mean, I'm looking at doing something by the end of September. I've already briefly mentioned it on my Instagram account where I've just said, like, would something more towards South Dublin or Wicklow or Bray be more suitable for people? And I think given the area that it's in, probably somewhere around South Dublin is going to be easier to navigate, where we can find a few locations that we can do some of this work outside or some indoor locations, whatever it may be. But obviously I just want to start it off and realize that it'll be small at the beginning, but as more and more people get interested, the material itself becomes more understood with that sort of brief few people to kind of use almost as a sounding board, and it'll expand into something crazy, and hopefully that becomes more of a thing where obviously for me and for my practice and what I want to give back will be really important in terms of developing the material, having people very close to me, and creating my own little community. But then how does that expand out into Ireland as a whole? I think that will be an interesting thing maybe for years to come, is seeing how Ireland develops in terms of the movement scene, where it is more established, I suppose, in these different areas of Europe and America. What does that mean for Ireland as a movement community going forward? And hopefully I can be part of that. I know I'll be part of that along with some other really, really great people, great practitioners, great teachers. So this, in some sense, is just a little bit of accountability, maybe the same way that I wanted the accountability of the 28-day handstand challenge was, just to say, cool, something coming potentially in September, in-person group, looking at more of a movement focus. I'll be breaking things down, certainly over the podcast episodes and on my social media, about what that entails, what that actually looks like, and how a school like that would be structured. So keep an eye out for all that stuff. I'm sure there'll be in-person stuff over the summer. I just feel like summer holidays in Ireland are such an important thing. People are all over the place. So to actually get and nail people down to say, okay, you're going to be somewhat engaged and invested in this is September time. Just seems like the most logical sort of time to do it. So it gives me plenty of time to just sort of, I've already collated a lot of the material that I want to teach. It's just bringing it together in a new way, in an in-person format. So plenty of things to look out for over the next little while. If you're interested in some of this material, you have any questions already, like you can reach out to me on Instagram for sure. That's probably the best way to get in touch with me. So if you search at ronan.lewins, you're going to find me. And just reach out, start a conversation, ask if you're interested in the school itself coming in September. Then let me know. The more people that I know, the better, so that I can reach out to those people come September and give them some more finer details and stuff like that. So hopefully this sparks something for you. If it is something of interest, we'd be looking at various things like handstands, all of this material like acrobatics, various different things. So as I said, not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail here because this episode is already plenty long. So I'll leave it at that for today, folks. Thank you very much for joining me. Hopefully you've gained some insights as well into a handstand journey that's not necessarily just 28 days long, but obviously to the point of where you want your handstands to go. Fingers crossed that's what you got from this. Questions, you can send me on. Even share this episode if you find this is going to be relevant for someone that you know. I'd really appreciate that. Sure, even review it as well. I'm not sure how you go about doing that. You'll probably find it on your podcasting platform that you're listening to this on. Leave a review, obviously a 5-star review, nothing less. But I appreciate you. Thanks for listening. Really looking forward to how this develops, this podcast, and how the practice develops, and how everything that I'm doing develops over the next little while, and a community that's going to be developed as a result of that. Okay, so I'll see you soon. Take care.